It's funny, two of our daughters are driving now. So I have a 16-year-old and a 15-year-old. And I don't drive cars anymore. You may say that I've arrived because I have my own chauffeurs at this point. But there is a progression that must take place, that we are being intentional about as they become more confident behind the wheel. And it was interesting, those first few steps, I always thought I would be the father who was like kind of laid back and chill and relaxed. And it ended up being much more uptight than I thought I would be. But I've had to progress myself and grow myself. But this intentional process, for years, you're sort of modeling for your kids what it looks like to drive safely, or not, depending on whatever you're modeling. Then, when they turn 15, you're teaching them while you're driving. Hey, notice how I get to this light and I'm putting on my blinker and I'm doing this, I'm doing that. I'm going to keep moving to this lane because I know my left turn's coming soon. You have to think differently as a parent when you start doing this. You start to realize there's a lot more complicated and unexpected things that happen on the road than you would expect. And then you move on to sort of coaching them while they drive. So they're behind the wheel and you're trying to remain calm and just give directions and think with foresight to give them enough time to make decisions. And eventually you're celebrating because they're driving on their own. And you're praying a lot more than you used to. But you're celebrating and you're getting the little text, made it safely. And you're like, yes, thank you, Lord, And there's a progression that takes place. And it's essential for them to become, in America especially, it feels like it's essential for them to become independent adults. They need to learn how to drive so they can go places and meet people and do things. Kate drove to church last week so she could run the slide, or 2 weeks ago so she could run slides, I think. And she did it all on her own for the very first time. We were celebrating that. And we're so excited to see her mature as a driver and even just the new opportunities that she has now because she's driving that are kind of opening up. I was also excited to not have to drive here at, very early in the morning to get her here on time. But what if my kids were to get stuck or to sort of give up on their training early? Or they were never to mature in this area or never become proficient in the area of driving? Their value to me would not change a bit, right? They're my kids. I love them no matter what. But it would be flat out dangerous for them and for everyone on the road if they don't progress and become effective drivers who are mature and responsible. Progression in this area matters. This morning, I want to talk about a more important progression, both this week and next week, really. If we don't progress in this area, it will stunt our maturity and could even be dangerous for us and for others. It's the journey of being a disciple to then going on to make a disciple of Jesus. And guys, I'm concerned that many Christians get stuck on this journey of discipleship and they never truly move into the driver's seat, so to speak. Or perhaps they do for a minute, but it's too unpredictable, which is scary. And so it's hard to stick with. Or perhaps they get in a wreck and they don't want to do it again. Or maybe they haven't been taught in the first place how to make a disciple. Or maybe they're just content letting a parent drive. But that is not the call of Christ, right? The American church is in decline right now, is what the stats will tell you. Around the world, Christianity is actually growing and thriving. Okay, so researchers say that about 170,000 people are coming to Christ every day. Christianity is growing on a global scale, but not here in America right now, not here in our country. Many are saying the cause of this is a crisis of discipleship. In other words, maybe the American church has become a nursery of infants living on milk rather than a group of mature disciples of Christ. And as we know, infants are vulnerable. There was an interesting study that came out, a 2024 State of Theology report, Lifeway Research and Ligonier Ministries. They do this every 2 years. And these are some of the interesting things they found out about those who claim to be U.S. evangelical Christians. 56% of U.S. evangelical Christians believe God accepts the worship of all religions, including Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Isn't that interesting? As you know, this is completely incongruent with the words of Christ himself. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. But over half of people who claim Christianity in this country would say otherwise. 43% say Jesus was a great teacher, but he was not God. Well, Jesus said, I and the Father are one. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So why the difference there? 38% say religious belief is a matter of personal opinion. It is not objective truth. Yeah, this is sort of the you do you cultural view slipping into the church. It's too controversial these days to say whatever God says is true, whether you or I can receive it or not. Which, by the way, Christianity's always been controversial from the beginning, right? It basically started as a controversy. Jesus and his disciples, they were killed for what they said was objective truth. And this is one that strikes me too. A quarter of people who claim Christianity here say the Bible, like all sacred writings, contains helpful accounts of ancient myths, but is not literally true. You know, my experience with young Christians on college campuses where I spend a lot of my time is that they want to know God. But there's a diminishing sense of capacity in this busy digital society that we live in to actually slow down, open this ancient book and study what God might have to say to them, to go deep and connect with God in this book. So God's word is sort of only received in sound bites by a lot of folks who claim Christianity. It's sort of like social media posts, a little verse, the verse of the day. These things are good and helpful, but over time, if that's all that we intake, it starts to sound like good suggestions instead of God's authoritative word in our lives. So what are we to make of this, right? It's a crisis of discipleship. It is time for our people to start eating solid food, but they are stuck on milk. So we're going to dig into this over the next 2 weeks. What does it actually look like for us to disciple our people, to train them to know God, to train them to share their faith with others, to train them to reproduce spiritually, you might say? We want to get after this in our church. Disciples, they have to be made. They don't just sort of happen. It's not just a drift into being a disciple. Jesus said to his disciples, go and make disciples. There's an intentional process. It's a progression for you and for me. It's a journey that we are on with Jesus. But how do you do it? How do you disciple people so that they're not tossed back and forth by sort of the waves of the culture that we live in, but they're grounded in the grace and the truth found in a thriving relationship with Jesus? Well, before we talk about how to make a disciple, we need to know what a disciple is so that we know what we're sort of building towards in someone's life. And so that'll be the focus of this time together this morning. The word disciple in the Bible, it comes from the Greek word mathetes. And this can mean a follower, a learner, a student. It does carry with it a little bit more than the idea of, if you're like me, kind of the short-term learning student, like you sort of study for the test, you take the test, and you forget the information. That was very antithetical to what this word mathetes meant. You had not learned it. You were not a disciple until you were living it, until you were applying it to your life. Perhaps a better word would be apprentice. Some people are favoring that word in the English language. It's an apprentice, picture an apprentice learning a craft from someone else. They're listening, they're watching, they're imitating their teacher with the intention of becoming, to sort of mastering that skill and then being able to bring on other apprentices themselves. A disciple was to follow his master so closely that there was this common blessing in ancient Israel. And disciples of a rabbi would say to each other, may you be covered in the dust of your rabbi. May you be covered in the dust of your rabbi. In other words, may you walk so closely to your master that the dust of his feet kicks up onto you until you're covered in it. It's amazing we get such an up-close and personal picture of Jesus with his disciples. 4 different accounts in the Gospels. And they're intimate stories. And as we read them and we seek Jesus in the Scriptures and sort of immerse ourselves in the story, we get the dust stirred up, and it starts to cover us too. Yeah, there are many things we could extrapolate from the Bible, from the things Jesus said about what it means to be a disciple, but Jesus himself, he clearly states it. What does it mean to be a disciple? About 5 times. He says it real plainly, a phrase that's sort of like, this is what it means to be a disciple, proving yourself to be my disciples, showing yourself as a disciple. And so I love the idea of looking at those 5 statements that Jesus makes and saying, let's get our mind around what, if you were to boil it down to a few things, what does it mean to be a disciple of Christ? And so we'll be looking at those 5 things this morning. I can tell you on the front end, they're all really hard. They are probably going to be the most difficult things you and I ever give ourselves to. And I'll tell you, it'll be the most wonderful thing you can ever give yourself to.